How weird are silent protagonists? When you think about other mediums of storytelling, like film or the written word, a silent protagonist isn't, completely unheard of, but it's certainly nothing close to the norm. However, in video games, the silent protagonist is kind of its own thing, a whole trope of its own. Most of you don't even bat an eye at the fact that you've played dozens of different garmless mutes and capable of communicating with the world outside of weirdly specific dialogue boxes. So that's what I want to talk about today, namely, what is a silent protagonist and why it's used so much in video games. So let's start with the easy part, and some of this stuff is going to seem pretty obvious, but I kind of feel like it needs to be at least mentioned before I can get to some of the more interesting stuff later on. Anyways, a silent protagonist is simple, right? It's literally in the title, a leading character who doesn't talk. But that's not entirely true, is it? Silent protagonists do talk, sometimes. Let's look at what's probably the biggest example possible, Mario. Mario makes all kinds of noises when he's running through a level. Wahoos, ha-has, and the odd... the guy literally has a catchphrase.
It's me, Mario!
And yet, he is without a doubt a silent protagonist. What a silent protagonist actually is a character who lacks dialogue, rather than one who can't talk altogether. So, again, using the Mario example, he can happily wahoo his way all the way to the little flagpole waiting for him at the end, but as soon as Bowser appears to spirit Peach away for the umpteenth time, he'd better keep his damn trap shut. But this is where things start to get interesting, because, you see, while a silent protagonist sounds exceedingly simple, it actually ends up being that there are a lot of different ways one can go about incorporating one into a game. For proof of that, just look at these three characters, Gordon Freeman, the Persona 5 protagonist, and Crash Bandicoot. They are all completely different characters, and yet easily fall under the catch-all term of silent protagonist. So let's get into the nitty-gritty here. What exactly does this entail? To start with, silent protagonists fall under two very broad categories. These categories get more specialized the farther you go into them, but for now you can separate them into two. The two types are silent protagonists without a personality, and those with a personality. Let's start with the former. Now, I call it this, but it doesn't really mean that the characters don't have a personality. Outside of games with absolutely no plot, like the original Pac-Man or Asteroids or something, most silent protagonists will at least have something of a personality. The commander of XCOM never talks, you never see his face, heck, you don't even know if it's a he to begin with, and yet, through the small amount of communication the characters in the game have with you, you can at least deduce that the commander hates aliens, wants to save the planet, and probably really hates green sweaters. No, what a character without a personality actually is a character in which the game doesn't care about their personality. The game is more focused on the gameplay or the world surrounding you, and the silent protagonist, while probably the central figure of the story, their personality is really of no consequence. Dark Souls, Portal, and Pokemon are all good examples of this. The characters themselves are all technically the central figure of their story. One's salvaging the last remnants of a dying world, one's making a daring escape from a maniacal supercomputer, and one becomes the literal champion of the land. And yet, who they actually are is completely irrelevant. The world you're saving and the difficult gameplay is what's important. The evil science facility and the crazy puzzles that you have to solve is what's important. The little tame monsters that you force into tiny balls and send out into what is essentially a glorified cockfight is what's important. That's not to say that these characters have no character interaction whatsoever. Half-Life 2 has a bunch of characters who are very happy to communicate constantly with the expressionless Gordon Freeman and constantly worry about what he thinks of the situation. But his actual personality is completely ignored. The game doesn't give a shit what he actually thinks about the other characters. It's left entirely up to the player. And that's what kind of brings us to the main reason for why this kind of silent protagonist is used. Silent protagonists are the perfect vessel to let the player be a part of that world. That's obviously not a big revelation or anything. Silent protagonists are very often referred to as player insert characters for this very reason. But that's what can make these characters so interesting. The personality, the agency of the character is left entirely up to you, the player. You can imagine that the prince has a secret agenda where he hates his father, the king of all cosmos, and plans to create a Katamari so massive that it will absorb even him. Or you could just think, ho 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 ho, Yoshi. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because the game, as far as it's concerned, thinks that the character doesn't have a personality. But what about silent protagonists where they do have a personality? Because those most certainly do exist. Now, like the last type of silent protagonist, this one isn't so much about the fact that they have a personality, more that they have one that's important to the story being presented. This is something that's almost exclusively done in RPGs. And really, it just comes down to a shift in focus. Instead of a story about, say, a world being saved by a man, it's now about a specific man who saves the world, if you catch my drift. That's the important distinction. Suddenly the game very much cares about who the player character is, even if it isn't immediately apparent. Now with this type of protagonist, I find you can go one step further and once again separate the characters into different categories. In this case, now that we care about the character's personality, the next step is how much input the player has on that personality. You can create a kind of sliding bar for it. On this end, you have characters who are almost completely controlled by the player. Actions they take will usually have certain choices behind them, and the player will have free reign to make those choices themselves. These characters are usually very similar to the ones that I previously talked about in that they have no personality and it's left entirely up to the player, but the key difference being that the games usually give the character a way to express themselves in the world itself. This is usually something along the lines of an old man asking you for help and you can either help him, ignore him, or kill him, something like that. At the other end, we have characters that are almost completely their own character. They'll behave in certain ways, make certain actions without the player's decision, and for all intents and purposes, just be another character in the story, albeit a much quieter and blank-faced one. But why exactly do they make games like this? If you're going to go to the trouble of making a personality for the character already, why bother making them silent at all? Aren't you just kind of shooting yourself in the foot by making them less compelling characters? Well, once again, the player insert aspect certainly does play a part of it, but there are a couple of other reasons for why a developer might make a character silent. First off, choice. You see, choice is an interesting thing. It can add a lot of spice and replayability to a game, and it can affect many different aspects of the game. Sometimes it completely changes the outcome of the game, giving you completely different endings, and sometimes it's just letting you decide which of the cute anime girls your silent protagonist should silently penetrate. However, with choice comes inconsistency. Let's take an example here, the internet's indie darling Undertale. In Undertale, while the character does have free reign to make a bunch of different choices over the game, when it comes down to it, there's really only two options: pacifism and genocide. Either you talk with Papyrus about how pretty he is and share cooking tips with a thing from the Black Lagoon, or you murder your goat mom in cold blood because you're a fucking monster! Sorry. Now try to imagine what a character capable of those two dichotomies would be like. It'd be a mess of a character, one who pets dogs only to stab them in the back once they're done. Now, by the end of the game, the characteristics of which path you took actually does begin to appear. There's even a name for them. You're either Chara or you're Frisk, depending on your route. But at the beginning, you're simultaneously both of these characters, and the potential to be either one exists within you. And without a silent, mysterious protagonist to take care of the beginning of it all, it would be impossible to make a coherent character out of it. And that's the reason for a silent protagonist here. It helps to make diverging paths in a storyline without making the character feel inconsistent. The second reason for why someone might use a silent protagonist is as a plot point. This one's a bit odd and it kinda has to be explained through a case-by-case basis, but essentially sometimes the fact that a character is silent can be used to explain or create a moment in the character's story. Take for example the recent Fire Emblem Three Houses. I'm going to go into a bit of a spoiler here, so if you haven't played through the first half of the game, then you might want to skip ahead a little. But suffice to say, early on in the game, the point is made that the main character, Byleth, is exceedingly blank. He/she really doesn't show any kind of emotion, and the house leaders even at one point bring up that they've always found him/her a little unsettling to hang around. This is all brought to a head later in the game when Geralt, Byleth's father, is murdered in front of them. And for the first time in their entire life, Byleth cries. Now, exactly how well this is pulled off is another debate, but the important thing here is the fact that Byleth's silent protagonist status was kinda used to emphasize how little emotion they had, and was again used to really try to emphasize the point when we do see Byleth have strong emotions. Another different but rather interesting example comes from two different games, and surprisingly, despite how different they are, they have almost exactly the same plot point. In both Chrono Cross and Paper Mario and the Thousand Year Door, at one point the formerly silent protagonist suddenly begins to talk. Now, it doesn't take very long before we find out that the character has actually been replaced by an evil villain who's taken over their body. But for those few moments, the fact that the character can talk, it's kind of used as a device to sort of let you know that something's wrong. The status quo has been broken. Something that's been a solid rule from the start is gone. What makes it even more interesting is that whenever this happens, usually the other characters in the party don't really notice anything is wrong, at least not for a little while. Because to them, you're not a silent protagonist, and while you might have gotten a bit more chatty than before, they don't immediately have any reason to be suspicious, at least not for a little bit. It is a different yet still very interesting way in which the silence that a protagonist emits can actually be used as a tool for storytelling. The final example I have to give here is probably one of the most unique ones, and it comes from the game Tales of Xillia 2. Now this game, despite being a direct sequel to the original Xillia, which had two very not silent protagonists, instead focuses on the exploits of a new silent protagonist named Luger. Luger, early on in his travels, happens upon a very young girl named Elle. She's lost and is desperately searching for her father, so Luger takes it upon himself to help her find him. A good 2/3 of the game pass, and you do hear occasionally from the father, but you never actually find him up until this point. But once you do, the big twist of the game is finally made clear. The father was Luger the entire time. Well, a version of Luger from an alternate timeline. It's complicated. And the lack of voice from the otherwise completely fleshed out character that is Luger was used to hide from the audience the fact that the father and Luger are the same character. Now again, how well this is actually executed is debatable, but the point remains that there are a ton of different ways in which one could potentially make a silent protagonist being a silent protagonist part of their character. However, it can't always be for interesting reasons, and sometimes it comes down to the very basic, very simple third reason. Because it's easier. There's not a lot to say here. While some games will try to come up with creative ways to incorporate the silent protagonist as part of their story, a lot of the time the silent protagonist is just easier. There's, a few complications in how you write some of the other characters' dialogue. You have to make a lot of one-sided conversations, but for the most part, it is literally easier not to write a character than it is to write one. I think the best example I have for this one is one of my favorite games of all time, Persona 2 Eternal Punishment. Maya is a silent protagonist, but she was also a playable character in the previous game, Innocent Sin. And in that game, Maya was a very talkative person, possibly the most chatty one of the team outside of maybe Ekichi. So why did she suddenly decide to clam up this time around? There's a tiny bit of choice, but nothing that would make her feel deeply out of character. They never really use the fact that she's silent as any sort of plot device. There's kind of two reasons why. A, because Persona 1 and Innocent Sin had a silent protagonist, so they just kind of kept going with it. But more likely, just because it was easier. But with that being said, it doesn't mean that making a silent protagonist is just some lazy way of getting out of a bit of writing. Silent protagonists do offer something almost unique to the world of video games. So many games with optional paths and the like end up creating these devastatingly bland characters. Ones who wouldn't be out of place making these choices, but also end up being as unoffensive as possible. But a silent protagonist, while being the easier option, gives the player a chance to fill in the blanks themselves. Because so much of the character is left as a mystery, it is left up to the player to decide how the character reacts to situations. Now, don't get me wrong, it is a very fine line that a silent protagonist has to walk between being mysterious and intriguing, and just seeming like a byproduct of lazy writing. But honestly, sometimes it feels like, if a character is going to just be some bland, cliche, forgettable nothingness of a character, just making them silent can honestly be an improvement. Which brings us to the final point in this video. What actually makes a good silent protagonist? And honestly, there's no real easy answer to that question. There's a couple arguments you can make. For the more classic examples like Mario or the early Sonic games, you could argue that all that really matters is the visual design of the character. If nothing else about their character matters other than a memorable look, then that's all that separates the cream from the crap. You could also argue that a good silent protagonist is one who has a good reason to be silent. What a good reason is going to vary wildly depending on any one of the reasons I mentioned earlier in this video, but just having a reason to be silent could be enough to make the character a good one. Or you could even argue that there's no such thing as a good silent protagonist. There are interesting games which make good use of a silent protagonist, but none of them are ever compelling enough to be considered a good character. These are all valid arguments, and it's impossible to say that any one of them is right or wrong. So with that in mind, I'm going to give my personal opinion on what I think makes a good silent protagonist. How much you agree or disagree with it is up to you, it's just what I think. And what I think is for a silent protagonist in a plot-driven game to be effective, they need to be as important to the story as possible while simultaneously being as unobtrusive as possible. Let me explain what I mean by that. In Shadow of the Colossus, the goal of the game is to resurrect a dead girl. It's plopped down in front of you right from the get-go, and the reason you travel through these lands and fight these titanic monstrosities is because of this. But aside from that, you really don't know anything about the situation surrounding these two. Who are they? Are they siblings? Are they lovers? Both? How did they find out about this place, and why is that horse so damn lovable? None of it is answered, and it's left up to you. That's the kind of effective use of a silent protagonist. The entire framework of the story, the who, the what, the when, and the where, is laid out right in front of you. But the why, the explanations that fill in the blanks of that base framework, that's left up to you. It's something that lets you feel incredibly invested in the world you're exploring because you're the one piecing together what the heck could possibly be going on. It's tough to say exactly what I mean by this, so let me give you one more example so I can try to explain what I mean. Once again, we're going to go back to Fire Emblem Three Houses, so sorry for spoilers again. Now, the reason for us going back here are for two very key moments that happen in this game. One of them, I think, is made very effective by Byleth being a silent protagonist, and one, I think, is made far less effective by him/her being silent. The first one is the death of Edelgard. The death of Edelgard is honestly a painful scene to watch. You, the main character, have to kill her. This girl that you spent an entire year with, watching her grow and develop as a character, you now have to kill because she's become a sexier version of Lennon. Compare that to the death of Geralt. Again, it's a painful scene. Your dad is killed right before your eyes, and despite your best efforts, you're unable to stop him from being killed. But here's the difference. The death of Edelgard is the conclusion to her story. Her arc as she tried to change the world so that it wouldn't have to go through the same turmoil she did. You, Byleth, were an important figure in that story. After all, you're the one who brought it to its, conclusion, but it wasn't about you. It was about Edelgard. Geralt's death, on the other hand, is a part of Byleth's story. Geralt is not much of a character outside of being your father. We're not really witnessing the end of a character we spent a ton of time learning about and caring for. We're witnessing a sad moment in Byleth's life. To drive this point across, the next month is accompanied by sad music, Byleth hanging his or her head in despair, and all your students constantly saying how tough it must be for you. And this is the problem. Suddenly it's not about a moment in the game, built to bring out a strong emotion in you, the player. It's a moment built to show off the emotion of a character, Byleth. But Byleth is a silent protagonist, a far less developed character than Edelgard. And what could have been a strong emotional moment in the game starts to feel like it's forcing an emotion down your throat. Like the game is just flat out telling you how you're supposed to feel rather than creating a moment that genuinely feels authentic. Now, let me stop your furious typing right there. I know that there are people far less heartless than I who actually did feel genuinely sad at Geralt's death and didn't just shout, "Ha! Serves ya right, you rat-tail-wearing idiot!" Even Grail had better parenting methods than you, my god. But I get it, I'm not trying to say that that moment itself was done horribly. What I'm trying to say is that it suffered as a result of Byleth being a silent protagonist. Because his or her development and character is so much more limited compared to the others, it feels less genuine when we're meant to understand and relate to his or her emotions. And that is ultimately the point I'm rather long-windedly trying to make here. A good silent protagonist is one who doesn't interfere with the immersion of the player. One who acts as a window for that player to take part in the world, but never becomes too important as to force us to watch them for too long. If you're gonna create a character like that, then just write a goddamn character. Anyway, thank you for watching.